welcome to 40 years of cross-border muckraking. This was, this is my last week running GIJN, so I've been thinking about the past and all the cool stuff we've done over the years. And it occurred to me at all these conferences we had never done, we never recognized our own history and where this extraordinary movement comes from. And it goes back than even a lot of us realized. I mean, even I was kind of on the periphery, Mark, when you started doing InterNation, and it was in there, but I needed you to jog it. And it turns out we had people talking about cross-border investigative journalism in the late 80s, before the internet, before email, before cell phones. Journalists were trying to figure out how to do this. And the history is really fascinating. So what we've done is put together a panel of let's say, veterans of the Global Investigative Journalism movement. And so we're going to go through the history, and I think you'll be fascinated with some of the milestones that have appeared over the years. And these are people are, as we say, witnesses to history that is more important than ever now. So very quickly, we have Sheila Coronel from Columbia University, Mark Shapiro from, where are you from? You're a columnist and independent. Maria Teresa Ronderos from CLIP, the Latin American Investigative Journalism Conference. Grant Houston, who is chair of GIJN and professor of investigative and data journalism at the University of Illinois. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Nils Mulvad of Casa Mulvad, one of the pioneering data journalists of our time. So we're going to go chronologically, and I'm going to start with Mark. This may be more of a discussion than like formal presentation, so bear with us, but I think it'll be good. Mark, come on up, because I'm going to hand this over to you. But Mark and I were both young journalists at this crazy nonprofit in San Francisco called the Center for Investigative Reporting, CIR. It was the original nonprofit, and we were kind of the young Turks. I don't know what we were. We were running around having a great time. And then Mark's going to talk about that. And then he got involved in a project called InterNation, which GIJN just ran a story about trying to unite investigative reporters around the world. Mark, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you. Cool. Well, it's just so great to be here, and it's like David said. I mean, I've watched the efflorescence of this GIJN over the years. It's just been fantastic to see how sophisticated and broad-based this has all become. And so I guess I'll just talk quickly about the very early days. We just go back several decades ago, but quickly, the Center for Investigative Reporting. It was young enough, and I was just optimistic enough I got a job right out of college, actually working at this place called the Center for Investigative Reporting, which was a brand new entity. And importantly now, because I think people take it for granted, was the very first public interest journalism organization really in the world, I think it's fair to say. 1979. So
77.
They were founded. I ended up there in 79. Yeah.
But
so
the IRS turned down their tax application to be a nonprofit.
Oh, thank you, David. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
All right.
Because the whole concept was
Yeah, the whole nobody understood this concept of public interest journalism that would be funded by foundations. And it was actually the two founders, Quickly, who both came out of Rolling Stone and didn't want to move to New York and become a celebrity journalist, who founded the center and figured if they could get some money from some foundations, they could never survive with market forces doing investigative journalism. And so they got very small grants that enabled them to rent a little tiny office in Oakland at that time. And they were doing this kind of investigative work that was really, you know, it was coming out of Watergate, post-Watergate days. It was very exciting and in-depth stuff they were doing. And a lot of it was through Mother Jones magazine, some people might be familiar with. Anyway, I kind of stumbled in there, straight out of college, got a job as a cub reporter, learned a lot of what I know from David Weir and Dan Noyes. Yeah, to David, I mean, amazing mentors. Didn't go to journalism school or anything, and figured out, and here's the key thing in terms of the international scope that is just so alive now, is I got thrust into this project that David Weir was just beginning to look into the export of banned pesticides. Pesticides that were banned in the United States were being exported to developing countries. And he had some hunches, which were based on good sources, and he drew me into this project, which later became the main thing that I ended up doing. And in the process of doing the reporting, which later led to a book called Circle of Poison and got around and everything, but in the process of doing the reporting, I was like 24, and I'm sure David had similar experiences of eye-opening moments. We knew that pesticides were getting banned in America. The question was, how do you determine where they go from here? And it was the first time I realized, oh my God, you could get transport records from the Ministry of Transport, the equivalent of Department of Transportation in California, as to where the trucks, how the trucks were registered. Oh man, you could contact a port in Mississippi, in Gulfport, Mississippi. You could find out where the ships were leaving from and who owned those ships. And if you followed the import-export data, you could actually find out where they were landing, which it turned out to be in Nicaragua and in Guatemala and Honduras and the Philippines and Malaysia. And suddenly these boatloads of chemicals were landing in those places. And it was the first time I realized, my God, you could follow one particular strand of evidence and just follow it over multiple borders if you know what you're doing. And then on the other end, largely I said through David's connections, we had connections in Southeast Asia who could actually be there when the ships came in to Penang and the other ports, and we had contacts in Nicaragua and elsewhere, and we could put this all together. That was an incredibly eye-opening, journalistically eye-opening experience, and led to a book, which was called, led to a big article that got the National Magazine Award at Mother Jones, and led to a book called Circle of Poison, which was the first to kind of reveal the export of banned pesticides. Oh, and the trick was then following the fruit and vegetables as it came back to the United States, loaded with all the residues of those pesticides that had been banned in the United States. And that, of course, we got through USDA testing data and all these other forms. But the idea of following that trail was seminal, I think, in thinking of how you could actually conduct a transnational investigation. Another part of it had to do, because I was the junior reporter, I had to go stand outside a chemical factory in Los Angeles and write down the license plates of all the trucks leaving, so we could find out where they're registered with the Ministry of the Transport Department. Anyway, this later informed that the book got crazy dissemination, translated into 15 languages, and basically an unexpected bestseller in a weird, twisted way. That later, and I'll try to be brief, because a lot of people here talking about this experience, because I suddenly had international experience at the age of 26 or whatever I was, and had written a little bit for The Nation magazine at that time, opposition publication based in New York. I got to know the editor of The Nation, Victor Navasky, wonderful, 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 wonderful man. Passed away recently. Anyway, deeply wonderful person. And he was editor of The Nation at the time, and he had this crazy idea. He said, Mark, was often a glass of vodka involved. Mark, there's a bunch of magazines. They're kind of like The Nation, and you know we should be in touch with them. I mean, they're in Europe, Western Europe. You know, there was a Berlin Wall and everything. So he said we should be in touch with them, and basically maybe we could coordinate and do something. And I was like, I'd been to, you know, I'd done a little bit of reporting in Europe. I said, yeah, this person, that person, they're actually pretty cool. And so with the Nation's backing, they sent me to Paris in 1986 to set up essentially what I think was the first international investigative network. And my job was to find the writers and to find the editors who we could work with and get the stories that sort of following the money, following the power across national borders. And it was so eye-opening because coming here, I was based in Paris, had a little bit of French, enough French to function, and meeting the editors of Vrij Nederland in Holland, here in Sweden, Dagens Nyheter and Sydsvenska Dagbladet, this wonderful paper out of Malmö, and in Denmark, this kind of nation-like publication called Information. Each country had this. In Belgium, it was De Morgan, and in France, Le Venement de Jeudi, a wonderful weekly publication. And each of these publications had editors who were beginning to think like this, but they didn't quite know what to do. And then this American 20-something-year-old comes in with this crazy idea. And people responded, and they liked this idea. And so we began to do stories that came out through this mechanism called InterNation on international arms deals coming out of Belgium, following the expansion of the extreme right wing into Europe, and the attempts of the Pentagon to leverage European governments into going along with U.S. defense policy. A quick word about that. It was so early that I used to go to the European Parliament, remember the European Parliament, which was this kind of body that basically existed in Europe, had absolutely no power. But because they had no power, they would talk. And so I realized one of my best sources, my best sourcing ever, was actually at the European Union. I could go up there easily. I could travel up to Strasbourg. It's easy to get to Brussels. And I could talk to MEPs. They'd be sitting on documents. Why? Because they had to be told everything, but they couldn't do anything about it. So they were very happy to talk to American journalists. And ever since then, I've thought of the EU as a great font of information, although they've gotten a lot tighter now that they get more power. But it's a good place to go. Go to a political institution that has no power. And often you can get great information. So InterNation took off. We did a bunch of conferences. We did our first in Amsterdam with Vrij Nederland. We did our second in London with New Statesman, and then we did our third in Russia, in Moscow in 1991. The Russians here will know what an amazing time that was, that fluorescence of media. And in each case, we're building on this network of collaboration between journalists who would share information with the startling revelation, and I'm going to turn it over to the rest of this panel. Oh, I have to tell this story quickly about Kaplan here. The startling revelation that if you collaborate across frontiers, you're not competing. You compete in national markets. You don't compete in international. Brilliant, what an idea. So CIR, the big eye-opener for CIR, Kaplan, you might remember this, is we were trying to get some TV deals. We had a TV deal with 60 Minutes, and then we were trying to do a TV deal with NHK in Japan. And I think it was about one of Kaplan's stories on the Yakuza. And he did some amazing reporting on the Yakuza. And we tried to coordinate the release of the story with 60 Minutes and with NHK. And NHK said, you know, we want to come out, you know, on a Saturday. And 60 Minutes said, you know, we only do Sunday. And so we said, we can't work with you if you are not going to come in either after us at the same time. And the word came back from NHK. You remember this, Kaplan. I think it was Kaplan's story. It was because we sent them a note going, we have no control over 60 Minutes. We're like a bug on the back of an elephant. That was a note that Dan sent to NHK. And the response to NHK was, we are an elephant too. So with that, let's pass it on. Thank you.
We are an elephant too. Mark brought up some memories for me. A lot of this was done by airmail. I remember you guys sending out queries to like the International Organization of Consumers Union in Penang. And they get back these manila folders stacked with documentation of farmers being killed with pesticides we had banned. And it's hard to believe in the internet age, you know, how this took weeks, but they fashioned these cross-border networks with snail mail, and it was amazing. So Mark and I were at this kind of funky nonprofit, the Center for Investigative Reporting, and they had kind of taken the NGO model and married it with an investigative newsroom. And no one had really tried this before. It was a bunch of crazy freelancers who just came together and started doing stories, collaborative stories. Well, one day we get a visit from some people from the Philippines. They want to do this too. And I barely remember this, but this is, CIR was founded in '77 and had some modest years. Mark's story, Circle of Poison, was kind of the breakthrough. It won the National Magazine Award. And suddenly these liberal lefty donors who would fund, you know, an environmental group or a human rights group, well, these investigative reporters are doing public policy. Maybe we should take a harder look at them. And more money started coming in. Well, the Filipinos came and visited, and they were impressed apparently with what they saw because they went back and did something phenomenal. Sheila?
So this is like a serial here. So in 1989, 3 years after the restoration of democracy in the Philippines, you know, we had a revolution, a people power revolt against Ferdinand Marcos, where people went out in the streets in droves and without firing a single shot managed to get Marcos out of power. And suddenly we had the free press. But it was not the free press we had envisioned we would have. It was basically sensational, just doing day-to-day work. And several of us, young journalists at that time, were thinking of there must be a better way to do journalism without money to buy a printing press. And so in a visit to CIR, one of us was there, said, why not do a CIR for the Philippines? And so we did. So we had the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. We formed it in 1989, which was an auspicious time because it was the time the Berlin Wall fell. Well, it was also the time of Tiananmen. But it was, you know, it was the start of a sort of democratic spring in Southeast Asia. And for us, it was a proof of concept. You've proven that this model would work in the US, but would it work in a country in the global South that had no investigative tradition, that had just come out of a brutal and repressive dictatorship, where the press, or at least most of the journalists at that time, had no memory of what it was like to be free. And so we thought we could apply this model, but we didn't have the money. And so for our first year, we went from a borrowed office. We had no telephone because the phone company was a monopoly and you had to bribe people to get a phone. We had, remember those, does anyone here remember the DOS-based computers that had these green things? Yeah. So we had one DOS-based computer and a Selectric typewriter. Who of you remembers a Selectric typewriter? Yes. So that was all the equipment we had. No phone, one computer, one typewriter, but a lot of spunk because you're young, you don't believe, you know, you have no sense of risk or no sense of even trying to form a career in this business. And so we did. Because we didn't have our own magazine, we did like the CRI model, we co-published. And we co-published with existing newspapers at that time, and later on got contracts for television. So we thought, if this model worked in the Philippines, it might work elsewhere. And so there was a series of democratic transitions in Southeast Asia at that time. In 1992, there was an uprising in Thailand. Thailand had a free press. In 1998, Indonesians threw out Suharto. And so there was the beginnings of a free press and the beginnings really of Southeast Asian journalists coming together and thinking, we have this freedom now, it's a gift, we fought for it, what do we do with it? And so we formed the Southeast Asian Press Alliance, I think it was in 91, 92, and then we started doing training programs with journalists all around. I remember going just after Suharto fell, I remember going all around Indonesia talking about investigative reporting and the idea of nonprofit journalism. And people were there wide-eyed and saying, what is investigative journalism? Is it like paparazzi journalism? Yeah. So we had, it was like, they actually called it the crash program. And I went to like 9 cities in Indonesia trying to, imagine a world where we could actually hold power to account in above ground publications with journalists being out in the open, out in the sunshine, asking questions. And among them, we devised methodologies for doing that. Among them, because democratic transitions come with new institutions of democracy and new laws that provide for transparency and new ways of holding officials to account, including mandatory statements of assets. So all officials now have to file an asset statement. It was these asset statements which became really the core all over Southeast Asia of looking at the wealth, the ill-gotten wealth of officials, because you had the statements that said this is what we own, and all we had to do is to show, hey, you own more than that. You own more than what you declared, and you cannot explain it. So that began a whole series of investigations in many of these countries that held really power to account by just looking at the assets, examining for the first time in the history of many of our countries, for the first time what officials own became open to public scrutiny. And this reporting got a lot of impact, caused the resignations of officials at some point in 2001, led to the ouster of a president. But it really showed the viability of this model and the fact that there is a community of journalists, and that, most importantly, these journalists had the support of their readers. These journalists had the support of the people. This was a time of democratic, he used the word fluorescence, right? Democratic fluorescence or democratic, it's very different from this time. Democratic renewal, it was like a spring, all the flowers were blooming, and we were there. And it was really a magical moment. And it really shows how the diffusion of these ideas in countries where you think the least hospitable places for such blossoms of investigative reporting to take place are taking place. And we've seen it over and over again, not just in Southeast Asia, we've seen it in the Balkans after the transition in the 90s. We've seen it all around Eastern and Central Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we've seen it even in Central Asia, which had some of the longest and most repressive dictatorships. It's just what a little freedom can do and what a community of journalists who believe they can hold power to account can do.
They changed history in the Philippines. It was that investigation of the Philippine president became a textbook case study in how to follow money and bring accountability to a lawless regime. Let me paint the timeline a little more for you, because we can lose track of the dates. Okay, CIR, the original nonprofit investigative center, is founded in 1977. Sheila's group, PCIJ, was founded in 1989. 89 is actually a pretty pivotal year. Centers, associations in Scandinavia are set up. The Danes, the Swedes and the Norwegians in 89, 90 all form associations of investigative reporting that are similar to IRE in the States, which was formed in 75. You have Mark doing InterNation from what, 89 to 91? 86. And they're meeting. I mean, we thought, we sort of thought that the global conference kind of started things in 2001, but more than 10 years earlier, there were these predecessors in the, sort of fax age or aerogram age, where you guys were meeting and establishing bonds of trust. Also in 1989, a CIR-like group starts in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Public Integrity. And our good friend Chuck Lewis has the idea that he's going to set up an international consortium to go with it. And so in, Maria today said it was in 1999, they set up something called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. Was it 97? Well, what did you write a book on this? ICIJ's first big project is on the tobacco industry. And they involve one of Columbia's top investigative journalists, this young, dynamic editor named Maria Teresa Ramirez. Maria, come.
So at that point, I wasn't really an investigative anything. I was just a reporter, an editor of an economics magazine. And then they invited me to, or they asked me, somehow one thing led to another, and I ended up going to these meetings of the ICIJ. There were like 3 meetings of the ICIJ. That was luxurious times. We didn't do anything in those meetings. We didn't produce anything. I mean, we did talk a lot, but there was no investigation produced the next day, or nobody had to measure impact or anything. We just got together and thought about possible stories. And just before one of these meetings, we had done this story that it came in the most easy way, which is somebody looked one colleague said, Panama exports $100 million worth of cigarettes to Colombia. And Colombia, when you look at the statistics, it only imports 50 million. What happens to the other 150 million? Do it go to the sea, or what happens? And so we started digging on that. The person who was in Panama doing the digging was a fabulous reporter from Peru called Gustavo Borriti, who was in exile at that moment. And together, I was in Colombia, we started to follow why was this? Why trying to answer that? And then we discovered the whole black market peso exchange sort of scheme by which you could bring back the drug money from the States, but via bringing back cigarettes. So they would bring back the cigarettes, sell the cigarettes in the streets, the money was laundered, and the narcos could get their money back. And then in one of these meetings of ICIJ, one of the first, maybe 2 or 3, we told this story, and then Duncan Campbell, who was also part of ICIJ, said, there is these documents that, the British American Tobacco lost a lawsuit, and they had to put out into the open 4 years or 10 years, or I don't know how many years, of all their documentation they put it in the worst possible place in the UK. They described it as a freezing place in a little room with hardly any indexing. And then we just did click. This has to be connected. And so they found thousands, I think it's 11,000 documents among 8 million documents, with no OCR, no identity structure, nothing like that. It was all reading and freezing in this room. I wasn't part of that. That was Duncan Campbell and Maud Billman, who was the first director of ICIJ, and Eric, who worked with Maud, and myself. I was in Colombia, and I was very lucky to get a real life, person who was involved in this. How This person was very mad at his uncle. He was a guy from Aruba who had a smuggling operation of cigarettes, and he got mad with his uncle. And so he decided to write a letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia and telling them what his uncle did, which was go to Wimbledon, get really good tickets, all bought by BAT, and of course receive as many cigarettes as all Arubans, including women and children, could smoke like 4 times a year. And of course, this exportation of cigarettes from the UK to Aruba was not to stay in Aruba, it was to smuggle into Latin America. And he told the story of how they did it and why they did it. And of course, our colleagues of ICIJ in the States and the UK were finding the documents. And every document had this little thing that said DNP, DNP. And it had all kinds of flow charts. It was all analysis, market analysis, very sophisticated. We couldn't figure it out. And then we sat in, I remember, in a little room in Washington. And then they came out and we were figuring out, reading the papers. And then I read this word, San Andresitos, which Duncan still looks at me, and I met him not long ago, and he started yelling, San Andresitos, San Andresitos. San Andresitos is the nickname, at that point very clearly, the nickname for selling smuggled goods in Latin America, in Colombia. And there's a history why it's called like that, but it doesn't matter. So what they were saying is in the documents is that they gave incentives to San Andresitos. This is official company documents that they gave incentives to San Andresitos to sell the cigarettes. So that was a real strong proof that they were into the whole smuggling business. And then everything became clear. We discovered that DNP meant, in a very British way, duty not paid, all their illegal market. So we went, the next year, we went on to do similar investigation on Philip Morris. I did the part, that one I didn't do, I wasn't as in the center of the story. It was, I did the part of the Marlboro one. It cost the magazine where I was working all their advertising for a year of Philip Morris, because we published the story and they got very mad and they took out all their advertising. Fortunately, they backed me up. Now, this Marlboro man was the guy who was doing the smuggling from Colombia into, and the money laundering for Philip Morris, and that's why he was called the Marlboro man in Colombia. He went to jail, went to the US, was extradited, served his time, and now, you know what he's doing now, this month? Running for office of mayor of his town in La Guajira. And that's not the funny part. The funny part is I talked to a reporter who was talking to him, and he told me he's the best candidate. You know, compared to all the others, he's really much better. So what was a little bit like the lesson, and this I wanted to finish with this, the most important lesson for me about this cross-border collaboration is it's a different framework of mind. It's not about having free streamers. And a lot of people sometimes think that's collaboration. And it's actually more about trusting each other. I think trust is the big, big word. And how information from one country really helps discover the information from the other country. It won't happen if you don't have trust and if you don't really do each other. Some people are doing they do cross-border collaboration, but they send their own reporters to the country they want to do the story. And I believe that it is the whole purpose. So this experience resulted in 10 years later, the Colombian governors who had sued these companies for not paying taxes recuperated one of they had an out-of-court settlement for about $100 million, We could only see it, 10 years or so. A lot of them pled guilty in different courts. And for me, it was an inspiration for what I've been doing most of my life after that, since 20 years, the last 20 years, especially in the last few years. What we do now, which is cross-border collaboration in Latin America, I saw that there wasn't enough of that. There was not an organization that was really having people come together. And now we've worked with 90 different media partners in Latin America with CLIP and done all kinds of investigations. And we can only find stories because we get pieces from different places. And also the other lesson I learned is that it protects you. These networks protect you. I wouldn't have dared ever to have done investigative reporting on smugglers and drug dealers in Latin America or in Colombia if I hadn't felt there was somebody holding my back. And that's how many people feel today. This is the only way to work together. When I was doing the Marlboro story, several sources got killed. It was quite a dangerous situation, and yet we were able to do it and publish it, and of course we didn't have a sense of danger, like Sheila said, no? And so now I'm still doing cross-border collaborative stories in Latin America, and having, exposing and holding power to account in many of the countries. Thank you.
Quick question for Maria Teresa. For that first investigation on tobacco, how were you communicating? Did you have faxes? Did you have early email?
Yeah, we did have email, very early email, and we had PGP, the encryption system, but it was so big and computers were so small that I completely froze the whole system of the magazine. They almost killed me. And then I got this call from the judicial police of Colombia. And I had like a friend there, like a source there, and he said to me, "Why are you encrypting emails?" And nobody's encrypting emails in Colombia except us, which is the police. And I said, "Well, we're doing an investigation that's very complicated." And he said, "Oh, okay." He didn't ask anymore. But it was so rare that even the police realized we were using it. And when we found tons of documents that we didn't publish in that first story, that, Argentina, this amount of documents, Brazil, this, we had to send them all those documents. We had no way to put these documents in a place and so that they could, so we had to DHL, FedEx. We put big bags of documents and FedEx to Argentina and Brazil so that they could read, and that's the way they sent the documents to me from Washington to the ones they found about the Fernandecitos and all of that.
I love that San Andresitos story because it shows the power of cross-border reporting. None of the Western reporters understood what that meant, and Maria Teresa knew it immediately when she saw it in the documents. And it's the power of crossing cultures and languages. All right, let me go back to the timeline. I mentioned 1975. This is right after Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. The first National Association of Investigative Reporters is formed, IRE. I got involved in the 80s with it. By 94, they'd hired a young fellow who had shared a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting at a regional daily, Grant Houston, and he was very interested in data, and he helped found the National Institute of Computer-Assisted Reporting, the first real center for data journalism in '97, Brant becomes executive director of IRE. And Brant was pretty interested in crossing borders. Somehow, Brant, you meet up with this Danish dude, Nils Molvad, who has caught the bug and created something called DICAR, right? The Danish Institute of, what was it, analytical? What kind? Yeah. Anyway, these guys are doing workshops on what's becoming a pretty hot new field called CAR, Computer Assisted Reporting. And Brant is over in Denmark, and they're doing a workshop. And well, we wrote this up. You guys probably want to tell this story, but I'll steal a little bit. You're having a glass of wine, and Brant says, next time, why don't we invite the world? And that is the beginning of both the Global Investigative Journalism Conference and GIJN. Gentlemen?
I prepared some slides, so please put the first one up. Just before this conference, I visited Brant and his wife in California in their summer house, and we were interviewed by the Scoop magazine on the background of starting GIJN. And somehow we were inspired of the more relaxed situation, so it turned into more of the personal story about starting this. It's a really good description on the GIJN website, which also have some of the personal story, but there is more to it. Brant and I identifying each other as people who can be trusted on and who are the doers. And I think after reading this interview, when he published it, we need stories like this on every organization. We have some of it here now from the different things, but we need even more from all the different organizations involved in the network, so we don't forget this history, because this is part of it is the decisions on board meetings and what is done in investigations, and a lot of it is also people knowing each other, finding this is important and we can do it together, and then just start to do it. Just before Brant actually proposed that we should do global, the year before I was at an IRE conference where the whole board of GREV's organizations was meeting with the IRE board, discussing what to do internationally. And I was the only one from Denmark at that conference, or we were two. And I was thinking, such a huge initiative, they can move everything. But this was board members, and they are very good in talking, not so good in doing. So nothing happened. Before Brant, he approached me saying, why don't we make it global next time? I have made a tip sheet as well. You should change this, the slide, go with the next one. This is this interview with Brant and me from the Scoop magazine, and if you go to the next one, it says about these different organizations, and on the tip sheet there is a link to the English version of the interview with Brant and me, which can perhaps inspire you to make a more personal version of the story of the organizations you have been part of. And I have been involved in many of these organizations taking the initiatives, and I think I would tell you a little about FarmSubsidy, which In Europe, this is huge. It's when we got the data out first in Denmark in 1994. This was, in 2004. This was around 55% of all the money giving out from the European Union that goes to farm subsidy. It has been a big secret for so many years on who is getting the money, and we actually succeeded in getting it out in Denmark. And then a crazy guy in UK the year after got it out in UK. He was a former advisor for the Minister of Agriculture. He has no background in journalism, and he was a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. So we planned to make a meeting, and he invited a lot of different people, members of the European Union, different organizations, and we ended up forming an association, the FarmSubsidy, and the idea was that we could work together with all these if the aim only was to get out the data and publish them. So could everybody do whatever they wanted with the data. And it turned out it was a pretty good model. In the end, the Commission decided that all farm subsidy data should be public. And it was funded first by the European Social Fund, which funded our work in GIJC, and then later on by Hewlett Foundation. And when they didn't want to fund it anymore, we stood in a dilemma. You can say, what is the next step when we have no funding? And GIJC thought it could be a possibility to turn it more into an organization of lobbying the parliament. And I thought it would be more wise to turn it into a more journalistic association, where it was not only farm subsidies, but investigative journalism and the work on data, journalism, and cross-border in Europe. So we have had a yearly conference in farm subsidy called Data Harvest, because every 1st of May the countries should publish their farm subsidies, and we met a week after or something like that, collected all the data, found good stories in the different countries, helped people publishing these stories. So this yearly meeting, Data Harvest, then after the Hewlett Foundation stopped funding this, turned out to be the yearly European conference on data and investigative journalism. And it has been growing, and it's a huge place to meet people working in Europe. I'm also set here, we have the Danish Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, which was made very much after inspiration for what they do did at that time in US. And if there is one thing about the farm subsidy which is in my tip sheet, and it is the only or the best story about this whole process is done by Staffan, who sits there and is part of a long description on how to get funding for your stories, where this is in the middle of all this. So we don't have this real history of farm subsidy, which somebody at some point should write down. If you take the next one, there is another important thing. It's the GIJC thing, where we have got funding from the European Social Fund, and in US you don't normally take money from governments or state things. Yes, okay. Yeah, but this is the only way we can do it in Europe, pretty much. It has changed now, but it was pretty much what we can do. And we couldn't get any more money for GIJC, so the right thing was to close it instead of keep fighting for having it alive. And I think this is something I have realized, that it's perhaps even more important to know when to close an organization. And it can be kept alive, and people fight for getting money for these organizations and forget what is the real aim of sharing methods and doing good stories. So their aim instead becomes to be keeping the organization alive and having a living out of it. So I think this is very important to know. And it's also, change the slide. It was so boring administrating this funding from the European Social Fund, and there is other possibilities today, but I think somebody has to do this crazy work of administrating the crazy funds. But I really don't like it, and you should really be in for the project before you apply for money from some of these institutions. Okay, contribute wherever you can.
So you have all these strands. You have the early bonds of trust forged by what InterNation was doing in the pre-digital age. You have innovative groups like PCIJ and CIR being put together, and then you have IRE, this strong national association of mostly American investigative journalists, but it's having an international influence increasingly. And Brant takes the ball and runs with it. Brant, come on up.
So when I was thinking about talking about this, I was starting to reduce it to words, like code words, and some of them have already been said. Data, trust, collaboration, not competition. I consider a lot of this the education of journalists over a period of time. I think, especially for U.S. journalists, when there was a great banking, savings and loan scandal in 1981 and 82, a lot of people didn't realize the international economy were behind a great deal of that, but we didn't have the tools and the connections to really do the story the way we wanted to or we could. And at that point, some of the larger newsrooms had, remember when they were foreign bureaus? And so if you wanted to do anything international, you had to somehow get to a foreign bureau. And so but as time went along, people stopped getting travel money, and we were really at a point of like, how are we going to look cross borders? And then this wonderful thing called the web came along. It was going to solve everything, cure cancer, but not quite. And then we had data, and data could go, it was like water, it went everywhere. So with those couple of things, we could see all these networks and sub-networks, and it was easy to stand back and go, we need to connect them. And ICIJ was inspirational, but you really had to meet standards and to be a reporter on it. And there were people who needed training to meet those standards, and we were doing that at IRE. So suddenly, this combination of training and data and the web sort of really create a vision of we can really work together. And some of us were actually doing something I'll have a short panel on tomorrow on social network analysis, and that kind of informed some of our thinking. If you put together a network, it's really a collection of sub-networks, so not everybody works on the same story at the same time necessarily. In a few cases, that happens. So all this was going on in the 90s, and IRE and NICAR were going across the ocean into Europe, and then started going into other places. And you build up trust by training together, and then you're trained together, and you're talking about stories the whole time. And then it's like, well, we really ought to do this kind of story. And then I think in this sort of self-education we were all having, we started to get this phrase that local is global and global is local. And all this comes together, and it really becomes clear to me, actually. I was at Intown Harbor's conference at one point in South Africa, and I realized I was learning more about farms and agriculture in the Midwest than I'd ever learned from a journalist from India who was talking about the exploitation of Indian farmers. And I'm just going, you know, but we've really got to get something going here. And we've got to create a framework to cross borders all the time. And that's why it became sort of clear when I turned to Niels and I said, you know, I think we're ready. You know, we've got IRE and we've got Swedish and we've got the Danish thing going and we've got the Philippines and we've got all these subsets. You know, why don't we just get together? And the one thing I want to say is that about the whole thing is the first conference we had in 2001, I never saw so many startled journalists for the first 3 hours. They couldn't believe the number of people who were sharing their tips and their information. They were just in shock. They were just stumbling through the aisles and the chairs, and it's like, they're giving it all away. And then it's like, yes, that's the point. And you know, by 1 p.m. that day, after the lunch, it just looked like an IRE conference, except everyone was still smoking. But it was pretty much, everyone got it. And, you know, these things only come about at the right time when there's this sort of unsaid wisdom being collected. And it was sort of like, Niels and I just recognized something seemed obvious. And it turned out it was, but you just have to, as Niels said, you just have to kind of get it done and just close your eyes and invite people. But you know, what's such a pleasure to me is this, out of this group and this gathering, I know we can't count the number of stories that are going to happen, and we're going to be able to follow, you know, multinational organized crime, multinational corporations, sometimes the same thing. But we're going, you know, how many stories could we spawned out of this? Who knows? But you've got to get people together, and you've got to let them find their own way, and you've got to let them decide how they're going to collaborate. And no, you're not going to send your person over to that country to get it done. You're going to work with somebody from that country as equals. So that's kind of how it came together. Is you have these pieces of education, associations, and the big thing was data, and we could give up airgrams and whatever else. And what's the facts? So anyway, that's sort of, you know, brief overview of how all these pieces came together, and here we are. So, point proven.